So it's 1 o'clock Eastern time in Montreal. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Edouard Clément, the Executive Director at the Energy Modeling Hub. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. I'm going to start right away. Today, we're excited to introduce you to the groundbreaking Clean Electricity Regulation, CER, and showcase how our modeling services can assist interested parties in conducting comprehensive policy impact assessment of the CER implementation. The Energy Modeling Hub is a national network of energy and electricity modelers, policymakers, and other experts, all united by a common purpose, guiding the transformation of our complex energy system. Our mission is to support and facilitate access to energy models and modelers across from Canada in order to empower evidence-based energy policy making. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the financial contribution of Natural Resources Canada and the ongoing support for three funding institutions: Institut d'énergie Trottier at Polytechnique Montreal, Institute for Integrated Energy System at University of Victoria, and the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Allow me to introduce our two distinguished speakers who will guide us through the details of the Clean Electricity Regulation today and how our modeling services can assist in policy impact assessment. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Madeleine McPherson, Assistant Professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Victoria and the Principal Investigator of the Sustainable Energy System Integration and Transition, CECIT Group. Madeleine is also a valued member of the executive team at the EMH. She will be providing a brief overview of the CER and explain how energy modeling can support policy making. Secondly, we'll have with us Dr. Jacob Monroe, a research analyst here at the Energy Modeling Hub. Dr. Monroe brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise in energy modeling. He will walk us through our tailored use of two open source models, silver and copper, and demonstrate how they can be employed to assess the impact of the CER policy. So without further ado, let's embark on this informative journey to explore the Clean Electricity Regulation and the transformative potential it holds. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll find this webinar both informative and engaging. Please don't hesitate to ask your question using the Q&A chat box, and we'll do our best to answer them before the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and also stored on a website at the end. So let's begin. Madeleine, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Edouard. So I'm going to start us off today with a little bit of an overview or introduction of the Clean Electricity Regulation, or CER, and its rationale. And then Jake's going to take us through some of the more sort of detailed modeling that we've been doing over the last couple of months in the second part of this presentation. So just to start us off, the Clean Electricity Regulation, or CER, is the rationale for it is really that we are seeing this shift towards electrification that is currently underway. You can see on the right there the chart of Canada Energy Regulators' most recent Energy Futures report, which is showing the growth in electricity out to 2050, and in particular a lot of growth in the transportation and hydrogen sectors there. So we're really seeing that net zero electricity is a foundational element for getting to a net zero economy by 2050. And there's a few driving factors for that. Corporate net zero objectives, the adoption of green industrial strategies, rising demand for electric vehicles and heat pumps, and projected population growth. So there's, I would say, still a fair amount of uncertainty in terms of the increase in electricity demand that we're expecting by 2050. But most estimates are sort of somewhere between 1.4 to 2.5 times current levels. And to achieve this net zero electricity, there's sort of three very crucial steps: cleaning the existing electricity sources that we currently have on the system, enhancing energy efficiency in every way that we can, and then ultimately expanding clean electricity generation to help with the electrification or the transition of those currently fossil-dependent sectors. Next slide, please. So the Clean Electricity Regulation is a regulation that is designed to limit carbon emissions from fossil fuel generated electricity on Canadian power systems. So ultimately what it's doing is setting a performance standard The draft for the regulation has been released. It was released in October, and it's currently open for public comment until November. And that's really why we're doing this seminar today, right now, is to show some of our results about the electricity regulation and its impact on emissions and costs moving forward, and also open it up for other analyses that people may want to do before that public comment closes in November. The clean electricity regulation is expected to be effective as of January 2025. And there'll be sort of a phase in for the performance standard for existing units that are commissioned before 2035 that will then start being effective in 2035. So what is the scope of the CER? Basically, the CER applies to any unit that meets three criteria. First, any unit that's using fossil fuel for electricity, really in any amount, has a capacity of 25 megawatts or more, and is connected to a NERC-regulated electricity system. So the performance standard that any unit that meets those criteria must adhere to is then 30 tons of CO2 per greenhouse or per gigawatt hour of power produced. And again, this applies to any new units after 2025 that are commissioned after 2025 must meet this standard by 2035. So there's three main ways to comply. The first is to comply with that standard, 30 tons of CO2 per gigawatt hour, either by CCS or fuel blending, and that fuel blending could be with renewable natural gas or hydrogen. The second way to comply is to operate for fewer than 450 hours per year, and or limited to 150 kilotons of CO2 emissions per year. And obviously the third way to comply is to shut down. There's many exemptions. I'm not going to go through all of them. But there's an exemption for emergency circumstances when granted by the minister. There's a transition period for units that are incorporating CCS, so on and so forth. There's a number of exemptions, but yeah, getting into a little bit more of the weeds there. So what I really want to focus on is how modeling can play a pivotal role in understanding and assessing the clean electricity regulation. And I think, really what we're trying to do in this seminar is set the stage for a modeling discussion. And I want to just kick that off by talking a little bit about how modeling can support the policy impact assessment. So the policy impact assessment is a systematic evaluation of how a proposed policy can affect various aspects of society, economics, and the environment. And models such as energy economy models, as well as engineering optimization models, can and do play a pivotal role in the policy impact assessment. So they're really this structured way of simulating different the effects of these different policies on various aspects of energy, of environment and the economy. So the models matter and are important because they help policymakers foresee some of the outcomes of different policy choices. So this can help inform decision making and help policymakers optimize for different desired results. A key part of this is being able to visualize and compare different scenarios, and which can then help decision makers choose the most effective and sustainable policy paths. And so the models at the end of the day are provide these data-driven insights that can contribute to evidence-based policy development and enhance transparency and accountability. So the modeling work that's been done at Environment and Climate Change Canada in support of the clean electricity regulation is a cost-benefit analysis that uses outputs from two different departmental models. The first is NextGrid, which is a capacity expansion model that identifies cost optimal investment pathways that meet certain criteria or restrictions. So any policies that are in place, system reliability requirements, resource availability, so on and so forth. So it's basically asking the question, what is the cost optimal suite of infrastructure that will meet these criteria under these certain constraints? The second suite of models, or the second model, is the E3 MC model, which itself consists of two different parts. So Energy 2020 is a integrated multi-regional, multi-sector North American model that simulates supply, price, and demand for all fuels. And then Informetrica model is used to examine consumption, investment, production, and trade decisions for the entire economy. So together, these two models project the electricity system mix and related factors that can be realized. And in this case, running it under a baseline scenario. So current policies excluding the CER, and then a regulatory scenario. So same set of inputs, but now including the clean electricity regulation as an additional constraint or set of factors that are being modeled. So there's a bunch of different policy questions that one can answer. Jake's going to be presenting in a minute here on the 4 different policies that we modeled in our group. But there's a bunch of different policies that one could model and that we're kind of ready to model moving forward. So uncertainty around different types of technologies, what pathways emerge if we make different techno-economic assumptions. For example, the cost of renewable natural gas, or different emissions for carbon capture and storage. So that's sort of one suite of policy questions we're keen to look at. Another one is the degree of electrification. I mentioned there's still some uncertainty there in terms of how much electrification we can anticipate in the coming decades. So we can look at different growth scenarios and look at what the degree of electrification is on the power system and the energy system. We can look at different techno-economic factors for especially uncertain technologies or technologies where maybe we need more insight on their techno-economic parameters moving forward. So carbon capture and storage is a good example of that. And ultimately, what the insights we're sort of generating are on capacity or developments. So what will the energy landscape look like in 2035, in 2050? And how can we effectively plan for energy investments to get to that energy landscape? So with that, I will pass it off to Jake to talk about some of the assessments we've been doing with our suite of models, silver and copper. Over to you, Jake.
Absolutely. Thank you, Madeline, and a great start. So part 2, using silver and copper for the CER assessment. So at part 2, it's really important for us to make the distinction between the CER regulations and tailoring the CER regulations to our modeling frameworks, namely silver and copper. There are some assumptions that we've made for modeling purposes, and we will be clear about these. But this is a part mostly about the modeling of the CER itself. So first and foremost, I want to introduce you to our 2 modeling frameworks. On the right, we have copper, which is our capacity expansion and planning framework for the electricity grid in Canada. Of course, it optimizes the cost of the energy system throughout a set of periods. Again, it looks at generation capacities from thermal to wind to solar to hydro to nuclear, transmission capacity between regions in Canada. And it has an updated set of wind CF and solar CF data with 2,900 plus grid locations throughout the country. And hydro assets are modeled in 3 categories, including run-of-river, daily, and monthly hydro. On the left, we have silver, which is the strategic integration of large-scale variable energy resources. This is our economic dispatch model, or our production cost modeling framework. It provides an hourly optimization of a given energy system configuration and includes 4 stages, including the inputs processing, a price setting optimal power flow, a unit commitment stage, and a real-time OPF stage. Let's move along. So now we're talking about the major changes to copper and silver, specifically with respect to the CER. First and foremost, I'll go through copper first. It had the most amendments, and then silver has a few. For copper, first and foremost, the retirement of units. Okay, so of course, there's some bit of an acceleration of the retirement of units, or forcing some units to transition to a state of which they would comply with the CER or become backup. Two, this goes into that point a little bit more, which is preparing the model for 3 groups of fossil emitting thermal generation capacity, including that CER regulated capacity, the CER regulated backup capacity, and maybe that existing CER unregulated capacity until it transitions. Number 3 is the backup generators, which is a totally new concept for copper. This did not exist before, so we've implemented backup generators. We've implemented cogeneration, which previously in copper we combined with combined cycle natural gas. This has now been disaggregated, and we apply the net exporter rule to our cogeneration units in Canada. Number 5, updating the OBPS implementation in the context of the clean electricity regulation. There's a bit of an assumption there, but we'll talk about it soon. Updating the wind and solar capacity factor data with MIRA 2 data for the year 2021. I can say that this is for both copper and silver, but this is at least on the copper side at least. Number 7, projecting demand growth using Canada's Energy Futures 2023 report from the Canada Energy Regulator. Applying the investment tax credit, which is not exactly the clean electricity regulations, but it's something that we've applied to the model. And also we have enabled offshore wind development. On the right side here for silver, mostly it's a little bit boring, but it's mostly just the implementation of backup generators, operating hour limits, and your emission limits moving forward. So I'll go by these one by one. And so the first one, this is the retirement of units for the clean electricity regulations. There are 3 thermal technology types that are the main focus of the CER with respect to the technologies represented in copper. These are coal, diesel, and natural gas. Although coal is forced to retire by 2030 in our model, so the CER is never really applied to the technology in our simulation. Diesel and natural gas, therefore, are really the only technologies that are impacted by the CER in copper. Again, modeling decision there. And I should also say here, again, we're looking at, with respect to natural gas, of course, there's a few different types there. This includes simple cycle natural gas turbines, combined cycle natural gas turbines, and also those cogeneration units with respect to the net exporters specifically. Moving on. What I'm showing you now is essentially an implementation of a timeline so you can get a better idea of what this looks like. So basically, first and foremost, from the simulation years 2025 through 2034, units are retired according to existing contract dates. So moving on past that, we see that first big tick there for 2035. So for units that are still around in simulation year 2035, this really depends on the vintage of the plant. First and foremost, if that plant was built before 2015, the unit is older than 20 years old, and it must transition to comply with the CER. If it's built after January 1st, 2025, then it's considered new capacity, and the unit must comply with the CER. Okay. Now we have this middle ground here, which is for those that are built between 2015 and 2024, then it is essentially the commissioning date plus 20 years, which means for a unit that's built in 2015, it must comply 20 years later, with a caveat that it's actually 20 years plus the end of that calendar year. So if you were built, say, in 2015, that's 20 years plus 1, it would be 2036 that you have to start complying. If you were a unit built in 2024, you must start complying in 2045. So the point of this is that some units can exceed the emission standards set by the CER until December 31st, 2044. There's this transitional period between 2035 and 2045 in which there is some capacity that is still regulated according to business as usual rules. None of that emission standard is applied. And again, there's this transitional between 2035 where some of those will transition, and then by 2045, they have all transitioned and must comply with the CER, or they are backup generator units. Let's move on. Now we're talking about specifically with these particular technology types, what can they transition to? Of course, in the clean electricity regulations, there are a number of ways in which they can meet the standards and change their unit operations. With respect to our modeling, we've made simple decisions to what those units can transition to. Okay, they're a little bit more restrictive. I would say there's a few bins that we allow them to transition to. For diesel, you have three options here. You have biodiesel, you have backup generation, or you can retire completely. Biodiesel will comply with the CER by having an emissions intensity below the standard. Diesel backup generation is just regulated with different rules. You can run outside the CER standard, but you are capped at the number of hours and the number of emissions that you're given on the unit. And of course, that retired capacity just takes it off the system completely. Moving on to natural gas. Of course, we have simple cycle natural gas, combined cycle natural gas, and the cogeneration units. For the cogeneration units, it's the net exporters only. All of these have the option to transition to carbon capture and storage, renewable natural gas, backup generation capacity, or retire altogether. For the CCS and RNG, these are essentially complying with the CER by having an emissions intensity below the threshold. Backup generation units, just like diesel, they're regulated with different rules. You're capped on the number of hours, 450, and capped on the number of emissions per unit, 150 kilotons. And again, that last option to retire takes you off the map completely. Moving on to the next slide. Now we'll talk about the emissions intensity threshold. Okay, so the CER emissions standard of 30 tons per kilowatt hour or 0.03 tons per megawatt hour starts on January 1st, 2035. We model technologies with static emissions intensities. Okay, there's no difference between one ramping up and ramping down or changing their operations. There's the same emissions intensity for every megawatt hour that is produced. Therefore, which means that if a technology has an intensity higher than the standard, then it is not allowed to operate unless it is backup, in which case it has a different set of rules. Okay, there is a grace period. There's a grace period emission standard for CCS that's built into the model. Essentially, there's a grace period of 7 years from the year in which the CCS unit is built, in which they are given an emission standard of 0.04 tons per megawatt hour or 40 tons per gigawatt hour. We model CCS with a 95% capture rate, and thus this grace period is not impactful because it already has an emissions intensity below that standard. For other models, this could change, but this is our own model. Backup generators, our third point here. Backup generators can be created in two ways. First and foremost, they can be transitioned from an existing fossil-emitting thermal capacity unit. They could also be built brand new, likely for firm capacity and not necessarily operation. There's two major constraints that were built for the backup generators. The first one was an operational time limit of 450 hours per unit. On this, I've simplified that constraint to using the maximum capacity factor constraint. This is set at about 5.1%, which is approximately 450 hours at maximum capacity. That is a slight simplification of the constraint, but if you produce any joules and sent that to the electricity system, you would be counted for an hour of operation. That's not exactly how this constraint is applied. We had to simplify this because this would add binaries to our model and it bloats the computation. I had to simplify down to the capacity factor here. Moving on to the emissions mass limit, I have 100, back to the previous slide, sorry about that, 150 kilotons of carbon CO2 equivalent per unit. There's an emissions mass limit. We simplify it to a per megawatt basis because in copper, we don't model on the unit, in which case I simplified that down to the megawatt basis using the average unit capacity of fossil emitting thermal capacity units and coders in year 2021. Moving on. Net exporters and cogeneration. So just to define these one more time, these are industrial cogeneration units. They are a NERC connected unit. They produce electricity for their own demand, which is behind the fence generation, and they also produce for the transmission system. The CER is applied to units that are net exporters, which is defined as exporting one more joule than what they input. Okay, cogeneration units that are not defined as net exporters can operate in excess of the CER emissions standard. There's no application of the regulation, but it still must pay the carbon tax. You can't sly off on that. So you still must pay the carbon tax. Moving on. Number 5, updating the OBPS implementation. Our implementation in the model For the business as usual case, the OBPS standards are applied from 2030 or 2025 until the end of simulation. For the CER case, OBPS standards are applied from 2025 through 2034. The CER replaces the OBPS starting in 2035. It's important to make this as an EMH assumption. This is an EMH assumption. This is not written in the language of the CER. This is our assumption. And of course, we've modeled the CER replacing OBPS and being applied from 2035 to 2050. This is an assumption. Moving on, additional updates to copper. These are some small ones here, but we'll go piece by piece. We've updated our wind and solar capacity factor data with 2021 MIRA2 VRE data. That's 0.6. Number 7 was creating new demand input using Canada's Energy Future 2023 report from Canada Energy Regulator. We have 2 different demand profiles or demand growths. One is current policies, which is a 1.72x times baseline demand. And Canada Net Zero policies, 2.25x times baseline demand. Of course, when I say that, this is not a flat increase amongst all the provinces. They all have their different growth rates. This is an average of 1.72x and 2.25x. It's also important to remember that we have applied electricity demand from expected hydrogen production on top of the Canada Energy Future demand series. And this is for electrolysis only. So these numbers will be slightly higher than what they would have without the hydrogen on top. Moving on, we've also applied the investment tax credit in our scenarios, both to the business as usual and to the clean electricity regulations scenario. And last but not least is the enabling offshore wind development for copper, although in our results, it's not really developed, but just to make the point that we've implemented it in copper. Please move along. Okay, so this point is just showing you the 5-year step periods that we've used in copper for the simulation, going from 2025 to 2050 in 5-year intervals. Moving along, the last point here, it's a bit of a boring slide, and in some cases there was a lot more for copper, but for silver was almost set up for the clean electricity regulations already because it models on a per unit basis. But what we added to that was a number of running hours are now available per unit. So the total hours for any unit can be capped. Of course, that's important for the backup generator units. CO2 emissions are now available per unit as well with a running tally. An annual emission constraint on total CO2 emissions was implemented over the sum of CO2 emissions from the 8760 optimization problem. But it's important to mention this, that there's a bit of a limitation in modeling the CER with silver. It's a long-term scenario planning framework, meaning it's not one linear program, it's several linear programs stitched together. Which means that technically those linear programs don't see all of the available backup generation hours, the 450 hours, in each modeling implementation. So it's theoretically that you could run out of them earlier in a yearly simulation. One thing that you could do is set points or something of that nature, similar to that you do to seasonal storage if you want to keep up with it. I just wanted to bring this up, and that this is naturally a limitation in using silver with the CER. I would imagine if we use set points or maybe like an average number of hours for any month, we might be able to deal with that a little bit better, but I wanted to bring it up at this point. So now I'm going to transition in talking to part 3, which is the illustrative results. And so what we've done here is develop a set of 4 scenarios to apply the copper model to the CER for this analysis. These include the business as usual case, which is essentially the current existing policies until 2050. We also have the clean electricity regulations, which we have defined for you, both in part 1, but also in how we've tailored it to the models in part 2. And we're also using 2 different growth profiles, both from Canada Energy Futures 2023 report. We have a low growth, which is the current policies, and we have the high growth, which are the net zero policies. And as you can see there, that's 1.72x and 2.25x. Before I move on to the next slide, we just wanted to say the main framing of this moving forward is, what is the incremental impact of the CER? How big of a lift is it? Okay. And of course, we look at the incremental impact of BAU and CER, but of course, the main question is, what is the impact of the CER? We can move on. So we're talking here, I'll spend a little bit more time on this one. And so this is really a main slide here, our costs and emissions. I'll explain the different scenarios. Let's look at our legend there. We'll see in our dashed lines, those are clean electricity regulation scenarios. And our solid lines, those are business as usual scenarios. Okay, if you see the blue is the high growth scenario, and the green is the low growth scenario. Okay, so first what I want to do is we have emissions on the left and cost on the right. Let's talk about emissions first. These emissions are in megatons CO2 equivalent. We show you this on each year. We can see clearly in both cases that the high growth has higher emissions than the low growth. That's to be expected. However, what's more important here is the difference between the CER and the BAU, between the low growth and the high growth. Again, we see substantial emission cuts with the CER for the low growth and the high growth, but the impact of the CER on emissions is more pronounced for the high growth scenario. Of course, you can see the big cuts that go from 2030 to 2050 there. And again, this is a scenario that's very akin to the electrification scenario. So if we go on from the left and go on to the right, when we're comparing the cost, we see that the CER is marginally more expensive than the BAU as we look from 2025 to 2045. And we even see it becoming cheaper by 2050. Of course, these are undiscounted costs, annuity values, but just to look at that, again, marginally more expensive. So we see substantial emissions cuts with a CER for a marginal increase in the price, even a little bit cheaper towards the end of the simulation. We found that to be very big findings here. Let's move on to the next slide. The next slide here, we're looking at generation capacity. We have, again, same set of legend here. On the left, though, we have new capacity. This is new installed capacity. On the right, we have cumulative capacity. What we can see here is that the CER leads to more generation capacity than the BAU. But more importantly, there's an explosion of capacity between 2025 and 2035. Okay, look at that big bump there. However, the new installed capacity trends down for low growth scenario after 2030, but it's pretty consistent for high growth after 2035. So really keying into the development that needs to happen for those years. Okay. So let's move on to the next slide. Now what we're looking at is the generation capacity in the high growth by type. Okay. So this first point here, we see that fossil fuel gas development is large for BAU and CER, but that capacity is largely unused in the CER scenario. I'll show you a graph here in a second to prove it. We see hydrogen capacity present with the CER, but not necessarily with the BAU. We also see wind development over nuclear development in the CER. And also solar build is large, but bigger in the CER. Okay. And again, I make the point too, is that I'm going to mostly focus on some key results moving forward. We have high growth and low growth. I'm going to mostly talk about the high growth. I'm going to mention the low growth. We'll also mention in the end that you'll get the full set of results after this is all complete. Let's go on to the next slide so that I can prove here the fossil fuel gas capacity. On the left, you have the new installed thermal capacity for the business as usual case. On the right, you have the clean electricity regulations case. We see for the BAU, this is traditional fossil fuel gas development. No restrictions on emissions intensity, right? For the clean electricity regulations case on the right, we see it's mostly CCS and backup generation development. Of course, these generation technologies have very strict rules in the CER. So just because the capacity is there does not allow you to use it whenever you want. Very, very big restrictions there. Okay. We can see very similarly, let's go on to the low growth, to the next slide there. Again, I'm just going to mention this. Wind development, big in both scenarios. Solar, big, build big as well, a little bit bigger there in the CER case. And again, fossil fuel gas development is traded for wind and solar in the CER scenario. But again, you still see some fossil fuel gas there in the CER. Let's go to the next slide and show you what it is again. Very similarly to the high growth scenario, again, we see most of that as CCS and backup generation capacity for the CER, okay? And on the BAU side, this is traditional fossil fuel gas development. I'd even make a side point here that you see most of the old coal capacity is being retired in 2025 as well. Again, this shows you the retirement as well as the new installed. You see with the CER, it's basically retiring all of its old traditional fossil fuel gas from 2035 to 2050, and it's replacing it with newly restricted CCS and backup generation. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So we're looking at new install capacity for the high growth scenario. Okay, so first and foremost, more new install capacity in CER than BAU. We've seen this before. and the other results. We see that wind and solar development is larger in the CER. Wind build is substantial in 2025 if you look at these results. And it even grows from 2035 to 2045. Even though it slightly decreases from 2025 to 2035. Again, you're seeing an increase in that development from 2035 to 2045, okay? This last point here also is you see hydrogen capacity show up with a CER, but not necessarily the BAU. Moving on to the next slide. Again, similar here. Again, you're going to see a little less new install capacity with low growth, as you would expect. But there's more new install capacity in CER still than BAU. Wind and solar development are larger in the CER. Wind stays consistent in CER, the new development. It stays consistent from 2030, but trends downward in the business as usual case if you look, okay? And again, hydrogen capacity is present with the CER and not necessarily the BAU. Next slide. So what I'm going to go through here, we're really focusing on the province to province level results here. So we're showing you the provincial new install capacity. I'm going to show you 3 different years of new installed capacity, 2030, 2035, and 2050. Again, we're starting with a high growth here. So first and foremost, 2030. This is the year that coal officially goes offline, although much of it had been retired already. Ontario stands out, okay? Wind, solar, and storage in the CER, although no solar development in the business as usual case. There's much higher development in the CER than the BAU. When you're looking at the rest of the provinces there, the rest of the provinces are fairly similar between CER and BAU, although there's higher solar build in the CER. Okay, next slide. 2035 is the year in which the CER regulations go into full effect, or I should say they go into effect. Full effect is 2045. Ontario still stands out. Wind, solar, and hydrogen, in this case by 2035 for the CER case, although no hydrogen in the business as usual case. Much higher development in the CER than the BAU. And we see that there's higher wind and solar build in the CER. Moving on, much higher solar build, might I add, for that. Going on to 2050. So this is the end of simulation. Ontario is still developing large all the way until the end. Wind, solar, and hydrogen in the CER, but no hydrogen in the BAU. It's a bit of a repeat result. Much higher development in CER than BAU, although more substantial at this point, okay? Which looking at the earlier results, we'll see that the business as usual builds a little bit more capacity earlier and a lot less later on. We see with the CER, it maintains constant level of development from 2035 until the end. So my point is it's much more substantial even in the end, okay? Let's go to the next slide. And so the next slide, we're basically showing you low growth here. Again, 2030, the year coal officially goes offline. Similar results in that Ontario is standing out with wind, solar, and storage in the CER, but no solar in the business as usual case. There's much higher development in CER than BAU. The rest of the provinces, again, are fairly similar between CER and BAU, although much higher solar development in the CER. So that's a clear distinction between these two. Moving on to the next. So again, going into 2035 for the low growth scenario. Again, CER regulations go into effect. Ontario standing out in the middle. Again, wind, solar, hydrogen showing up, but no hydrogen in the BAU. Much higher development in CER than BAU. As you see, again, it stays pretty steady as we go on and then move into 2035. Higher wind and solar build in the CER, that's staying pretty consistent there. Although you see here that there's some fossil fuel gas development in Ontario for this year, okay? Probably trying to build some firm capacity. Let's go on to this last slide here. Low growth for 2050. End of simulation here, it's similar results. Ontario standing out. There's still substantial development compared to the BAU all the way until 2050. So you can see the development is staying pretty much on top of the BAU from 2030 or 2035 till the end. There's higher wind and solar build in the CER. We're seeing that pretty consistent. However, I'd like to mention here that there's some fossil fuel gas development for CER in the final period. I would notice that in the high growth, there was substantial, there was a much higher fossil fuel gas development in the CER for the high growth in 2050. Again, likely trying to develop some firm capacity. Much of it is probably CCS and backup generation. So if you have higher demand growth by 2050, you probably need that firm capacity to meet your planning reserve requirement. So you're probably seeing that in the CER. Moving on to the conclusions and the insights here. What really sticks out here, everyone, is the incremental cost for CER compared with BAU. It really is an incremental cost, but there are substantial emission savings with the CER per our modeling results, okay? The CER, moving forward, it has an impact that's more pronounced in a high electrification scenario with respect to the emissions, okay? We saw that in the high growth scenario, very akin to an electrification scenario. The impact on the emissions is very substantial, again, for an incremental cost, okay? So that pairs very well for that electrification scenario. We see large wind development that is very necessary from now until 2035. So this is hinting at the sense of urgency for short-term planning. But for that high growth electrification scenario, there's constant development from 2035 until the end. So we would imagine that wind developers are going to be pretty busy. You would need to plan for this, okay? Now going past our main conclusions and we start to think, we really looked at 4 scenarios here, okay? And so there's at least a bit of narrow insights that we could have grabbed. There's more results that had been produced with these scenarios. We didn't show you all of them, but we are going to make these available in a number of mediums, including spreadsheets, aggregated figures, reports, and maybe some other mediums as well. The point is that with a limited number of scenarios and with limited number of time today, there's more that we can do. Our modeling tools can help with an array of analyses, and collaboration will really be key to identify those priorities moving forward. And so we're really hoping that you and the rest of the community can help us in that. Thank you all. Maybe I'd like to mention here and finish with data limitations. And really just say that these are opportunities. We always have more time to do this. We would say that renewable natural gas was a real limitation, both in terms of what the future price would be and also the available supply of that commodity. This could probably change results, so maybe a little bit more research would be fitting. Also, future demand, both in terms of load growth and the degree of electrification. There's a bit of uncertainty here. There might be a reason to test a few different types of load growths and electrification pathways there. So again, more opportunities. And last but not least is the CCS attributes that we used in the model. The capture rate, we really went that, the capture rate is really not, technologically limited. It all depends on the price that you're willing to pay for that capture rate. So there would be maybe an array of different capture rate and technologies that we could model there. But as we say, please reach out to us and share your view, your data, and your insights. Anything that you can do to help us or for us to help you as we more better model the clean electricity regulations, we're very happy to do that. And with that, I believe that's all of my time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jake, for this excellent presentation. And before we conclude and open the floor to questions, I'd like to share a couple of resources and support that will be available from the EMH to help you conducting your own CER assessment. So we offer 2 pathways, as seen on that slide. Serve pathways. Basically, this option allows you to access our public repositories for the CER implemented version of silver and copper. You can explore existing models and documentation, access default input files, and conduct self-serve analysis. Should you need any assistance and guidance along the way to access those models, do not hesitate to reach us. And we also offer the assisted pathway. If you prefer a more guided approach, we encourage you to review the EMH pre-model scenario for potential answer. You can define your research questions and goals and reach out to us to obtain a modeling exercise template. So we have a template that you can fill out, send back to us. We'll run the model for you and share the results. Of course, you can find the code for copper and silvers on GitLab, and any other upcoming models from the EMH will be published there as well. For your convenience, we've provided a direct link via our website. All the models and data and document that you need are listed there. All the resources discussed today, webinar recording, the presentation, input, output Excel files, the graph reports will also be put on our website. And just maybe a sneak peek of what's coming up. So we have a brand new website that's going to be launched in the coming 2 weeks. So you'll be able to have access to tons of information. So our commitment is really to help you and empower you with the tools and data you need for evidence-based decision making in the energy sector. So we encourage you to explore those resources and reach out to us for any assistance and guidance. So I'll open the floor for questions. Please, I'll start by reading some of the questions in the Q&A box. Since we are a big group, I won't be able to give the mic. So if you raise your hand, please write your questions in the Q&A. Otherwise, please get in touch with us after the webinar. So Jake and Madeleine will take some questions. So I'll go directly from the list. So Jake, maybe an easy one. So it says that we understood that the 30 tons of CO2 per gigawatt hour standards apply to carbon dioxide, not CO2 equivalent. Is this the same in the models or is it different? So do you want to comment on that, Jake?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, at least from our modeling perspective, our emissions intensities come in tons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. So at least that's what we use in our model. So with respect to the legislation itself, not sure about the CO2e versus CO2. I was just sort of using the emissions intensities that I have for our generation technologies. So I don't know if there's someone else that may want to comment on this.
We can come back to this.
The
yes.
Emissions intensities. Yeah.
Right, and there's people from EMH on the line. So going on, can you expand on the reasoning for why the OBPS will be superseded or replaced with these CER?
Because it's a more conservative assumption, I would believe, because the CER is a full application of the carbon tax, whereas OBPS has a little bit of leeway on that, right? There's a bit of margin there to save. So we would think that the CER would be the full application of the carbon tax. And this was our perspective. So this was our reasoning.
Thank you. So how was storage considering copper when it's making investment decision? Is it simply a capacity resource, or does the optimization also have information about how the storage will operate and move wind, solar around? So I don't know if that question is clear, Jake.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it is a capacity resource, of course. It's also, well, it's with respect to the available solar and wind capacity as well, right? So it's not optimized in more ways other than, can you fill the battery, or do you need the capacity? So I would imagine it's more capacity resource. There's not a lot of funky constraints for batteries, like, battery as a storage market or anything like that. There's not much more for that. So.
Thank you. Wondering why only hydrogen, production via electrolyzer is modeled, and why not from natural gas?
We get electrolyzer and oh, absolutely. So again, this is with respect to the electricity demand, though, right? And so hydrogen production from natural gas, again, that's not coming from the electricity system itself, right? I mean, this is actual electricity demand from the electrolyzers, right? And so trying to look at hydrogen production using gasification or anything like that. Again, that's not with respect to the electricity system. So it's just transmission system demand that we find important for the analysis.
Great. And as we were speaking, so we got an answer from the regulation is on combustion CO2 and not CO2 equivalent nor life cycle CO2. So just a clarification. So this was confirmed by our colleagues at EMH. So is grid reliability considered for CER scenario? So you want to comment on that, Jake?
Yeah, of course. Well, I would imagine, yes, of course. So the planning reserve requirement is a constraint still, right? So you still have to meet your supply and demand balance and your planning reserve requirement. So yeah, those two constraints are still in there for the CER and the BAU, which is why the CER will develop backup generation capacity and not use it necessarily, right? Because you have to meet the capacity requirements of the planning reserve requirement.
And will all the intermittent renewable, with all the intermittent renewable, how will this be ensured that there's always enough power available? Are grid scale battery included, or is the gas backup capacity size to match solar and wind capacity?
Yes, let me see this. I mean, of course, that's again, the batteries that aren't included would be grid scale batteries. Of course, I mean, yeah, I mean, Again, the constraints for the planning reserve requirement are intended to help with this reliability, right? So there still needs to be enough firm capacity on that grid to meet the planning reserve, regardless of how much solar and wind is on it, right? And even with respect to solar is not given a very high derating factor for planning reserve. So you could have a ton of solar on there. It doesn't help you with your planning reserve requirement, okay?
And maybe I'll just jump in quickly. This is also where our chronological model silver comes in. And so that is, every hour of the year meeting supply and demand. And so that's a little bit where we do that double check to make sure that in every hour, in every location, there will be enough supply and demand. And then we'll go back and reparameterize copper if there's an issue there. So that's also part of the outside of copper, how we deal with that reliability and intermittency question.
Thanks, Madeline. So another question, for planned capacity expansion, how the capacity investment disaggregation works from copper to silver in terms of VRE techs?
Okay, so for planned capacity, how the capacity investment disaggregation works? In terms of VRE techs. Okay, so we have solar and wind, and then we also have recontracted solar and wind. I'm wondering if I'm
if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's just silver just runs whatever capacity expansion copper solved for. So copper basically optimizes, this is the generation, transmission, storage infrastructure needed in each of the solve periods. That directly gets transferred to silver, which doesn't optimize what capacity to build, but rather how to operate the capacity that is available in the system according to the copper results. And so the disaggregation though is copper we're running on a national level, and so each province is just one node, and then by the time we get to silver, we've disaggregated it with more spatial granularity there. And there's how we do that is through this linking tool that we've developed, which is also available on the GitLab to look at more details on that.
I was just say too, so wind and solar are already disaggregated in copper with respect to the point at which their capacity factor comes from, right? So that generation all gets ported in the same node in copper. In silver, we already know the coordinates of where that solar or wind would be, right? So we would connect it exactly into the network where there is a node. So
great. Another question, have you assumed any nuclear power energy as production pathways in province that have MOU in place for the nuclear energy?
Yeah, so moratorium, I think we're talking about. So I put a nuclear capacity constraint on British Columbia. So there's no nuclear capacity allowed in British Columbia. So is this, yeah, so.
And for province that have, planned nuclear already, so I guess it's already modeled, right? So MOU, that's agreement already in place.
Yeah, so again, if there's a project that's already planned in place, then it's in the existing capacity file, right? Because it's with respect to what's in coder's generation. Of course, nuclear itself can also just sort of be built brand new in the model as well, right? Although, yeah, connecting it to specific provinces' goals is not in copper. There is just a cap, at least on British Columbia.
Any result for the average price of electricity per megawatt hour when CER applies? Are we able to predict the average price of electricity per megawatt hour?
Well, the reality, silver would be better akin to doing this, right? Because it actually solves for the locational marginal price. And of course, we haven't done this in this project yet, so can't really comment on that too much yet. I would probably want to do that more for silver and not copper.
Perfect. Can you speak to how the movement of energy through transmission capacity is dealt in the models?
Yes, so we're talking about elaborating on OVPS and then CER replacing OVPS. And so, so essentially, again, in 2035, the CER, we would assume that the full carbon tax was applied. And so this was the assumption that we made from 2035 moving forward, because it would be a more conservative assumption. Okay, so again, there's no specific language in which that's the case in the CER, right? There's nothing that says that be the case, although there's nothing that said that may not be the future case, right? So we went with something that was a more conservative assumption. So.
Thank you, Jake. So the next one is how the CER cleanliness cost differs from province to province on the demand side.
CER compliance cost differs. Okay, I get what you're saying there. Okay, so the compliance costs. So, well, I would probably need to go and do a province by province, cost assessment, to be honest. I didn't have these results all the way on here. So I may reserve that for a later answer. So my apologies on this.
No problems. Going to the next one. So I think it was my questions that I've tried to ask. So can you speak on how the movement of energy through transmission capacity is dealt in the model?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I mean, so transmission is loud, right? And transmission development is loud. Okay. And so, we model transmission capacity between the regions, right? And sort of it's capped, of course, by its existing capacity plus whatever transmission capacity you add on to the system over the years, right? So it's capped with respect to that. I would make maybe one caveat of a statement in which, when we talk about contracted capacity between provinces, if there is contracted capacity between provinces, like firm capacity contract, those will be scooped out of the available transmission capacity. Okay, so at least respect, there's some bit of constraint on that. It's not really a constraint, it's just that we scoop the available capacity away from the firm contract. So
thank you. Moving on, can you speak, CCS on natural gas does not yet exist. What happens if it's excluded and replaced with SMR?
Well, I think the case here is better numbers for both technologies, right? Because both of these are early technologies, and so I imagine the numbers will get better, and we'll have to redo this analysis when those numbers are updated. If the SMR, if the economics get better, then then technically it may be lower cost. There's also more to that question. Is your province going to allow it, right? So again, there's at least British Columbia wouldn't allow you to do that, right? So my point here is it's allowed. The numbers can become cheaper over time, but of course there's still policies that may restrict you from developing it. So it's not a clear answer.
Perfect, and we'll take one last questions. There's plenty of those. We'll keep them and try to include them into a following report, and also share that with the slides. But the last question will be on the new installed capacity by year slide. We see retirement of storage capacity in 2045. We would expect the need for storage to be sustained as they're more intermittent renewable. What's the rationale behind this? I don't know if that's clear, Jake.
So yeah, so the question is clear. I believe the answer is, why is it retired? Well, that storage unit capacity was probably at end of life. And of course, why is it not redeveloped? I would imagine it's not the lowest cost with respect to the simulation, right? I believe that storage is built, and then later on hydrogen is built afterwards. So it's a good question. I mean, it at least looks at hydrogen as a lower cost option in the future. Of course, what we'd also like to say is that there's at least a few dispatch constraints that aren't applied here, which may make batteries look a little bit better than hydrogen, right? Of course, you can better simulate that in silver than you can in copper, and so we would encourage that to happen. So I would say that there's a good question. It's a good question why storage may not be developed later on, but it's probably with respect to cost. So.
Thank you, Jake. And I realize the complexity of answering those questions on the spot. So I appreciate everything you've been showcasing today. Thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you, Madeleine, too. I would like to thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today for this hopefully insightful webinar. As mentioned, the slides and the resources will be put on our website. So is the recording. Of course, your participation has been greatly appreciated. We try to follow up with the remaining open questions. Of course, this is one of numerous webinar we'll do on the subject. Of course, I encourage you all to stay engaged with the EMH, and please follow us on our social media, on LinkedIn, visit our website for updates on upcoming events, research and resources. Of course, we are excited to announce that our next major event is just around the corner. So the EMH Annual Forum, our flagship event, will take place in Ottawa on December 11 and 12. Registration is now open, and while it's free, please keep in mind that space is limited, so save your spot as soon as possible. Thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at upcoming event. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.